The Apollo spacecraft and the lunar module, the landing craft that enabled astronauts to walk on the moon. Returning from the moon's surface, the two craft had to find each other in lunar orbit, a procedure known as rendezvous. And then they had to link together, docking, to allow the astronauts to re-enter the mother craft for the journey back to Earth. President Kennedy had announced his country's goal of landing a man on the moon in 1961.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Yet in 1961, decision-makers at NASA had no idea how the ambitious mission, now called Apollo, could be carried out. At the time, rockets were routinely missing their intended orbits by large margins, and the idea of two spacecraft linking together in lunar orbit was dismissed as too difficult. But a small group within NASA knew it could be done, and their work led to Project Gemini, a new program before Apollo that would pioneer techniques for walking in space and above all rendezvous. But it would not be easy. In October 1961, NASA began testing a new series of rockets called Saturn. When the Saturn went into development in 1957, NASA hadn't been established, and there were no solid plans for how the big new rocket would be used. It was obvious that the Soviet Union had bigger rockets, and the Americans knew they had to catch up. Shortly before the first flight test, the president had announced US plans to land a man on the moon. And it became clear that the Saturn would play a part in what was called Project Apollo.
800 miles per hour. Hit the upper stage of our space rocket around and...
Yet even at this stage, NASA engineers had not decided exactly how a moon mission would be carried out. The early Saturn flight tests were almost flawless, and plans called for a bigger Saturn V and an even bigger Nova. Such ambitious heavy lift launchers would take time to develop, so an interim program, Project Gemini, was instigated. It would make use of the newly developed Titan missile, which was already being mass-produced. The Gemini launch vehicle was a two-stage booster derived from the Titan II missile. Its toxic, hypergolic fuel was well suited for use in a weapon because it could be stored at ambient temperatures for long periods, but for launching a human crew, it was less than ideal. The twin engine bells in the first stage were fed by separate turbopumps, but the whole unit was still regarded as a single engine. The Titan's second stage engine discharged through a single engine bell optimized for the vacuum of space. The rocket's inertial guidance unit was contained in this stage. The Titan II's heavy lift capability and the minimal development time required to adapt it for manned spaceflight made it a logical choice for the Gemini project.
Gemini 4, good Arvik, Capcom.
The United States Air Force had a great interest in Gemini, and several Blue Gemini missions that were exclusively devoted to Air Force research were planned. A top-secret group of Air Force astronauts was selected, and an Air Force orbiting laboratory was envisaged. However, these were cancelled because it was felt that NASA Gemini missions could carry out the relevant research. At the time, the Mercury program was underway. The one-person Mercury capsule was designed by NASA and built by the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation. McDonnell would also build the Gemini capsule. Outwardly, the Gemini spacecraft resembled its Mercury predecessor, with a similar blunt rear end and the same corrugated nickel alloy skin. However, it was built for 2 astronauts and featured many refinements. NASA engineers realized there were many new problems to be understood, so the Gemini spacecraft was designed to carry out long-term space missions. Propellants and life support systems were situated in separate modules that were jettisoned before return through the atmosphere. It had doors that could be opened in flight to allow astronauts to walk in space, and it was equipped with an elaborate maneuvering system that enabled it to change its orbit. The Gemini spacecraft was the first to be equipped with solid-state electronics and a flight computer. Leaders within NASA, like Wernher von Braun, envisioned a large rocket flying directly to the Moon, landing and returning to the Earth. 2 versions of this technique were studied. Direct ascent required the huge NOVA launch vehicle. The other method, known as EOR for Earth Orbit Rendezvous, required far more complex mathematics and 2 Saturn C3 rockets for a rendezvous in Earth orbit where the lunar configuration would be assembled. Engineers working at NASA's Langley Research Center had devised a 3rd method called LOR for Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. This technique required only the Saturn C5 rocket and a small lunar landing craft. No one outside Langley took this proposal seriously, because while the rendezvous of spacecraft in Earth orbit was regarded as difficult, rendezvous in lunar orbit was seen as madness. But the Langley group persisted, and eventually the LOR method was adopted, with NASA scientists being convinced that the physics was sound and that it could be achieved within the 1960s timeframe. In 1962, NASA recruited 9 new astronauts. Like their Mercury predecessors, they had to have test pilot experience, but they also had to have relevant degrees in engineering or biological science. Many of this group would fly to the Moon, but some would lose their lives. Along with the development of the Gemini spacecraft came the introduction of a new style of spacesuit that could be worn outside the spacecraft. The fabric joints of the Mercury suit had been replaced by a pressure bladder wrapped in a link net restraining layer that delivered greater flexibility and limb mobility. Because rendezvous and docking was such a critical part of the Gemini program, NASA modified the Agena upper stage as a target vehicle. Agena had been developed for use as a spy satellite, so it was ideal for use in Project Gemini because it was already available. It would launch atop the Atlas missile, which was already carrying Mercury astronauts to orbit. NASA was learning a lot from the Mercury program, and they were trying to design the Gemini system to eliminate issues that were perceived as problems in Mercury. All Mercury flights landed in the ocean and required an aircraft carrier, support ships and helicopters for recovery of the astronaut and the capsule. This was a stopgap measure, and it was expensive, particularly if a spacecraft had to make an emergency return. the US Navy had to have trained recovery groups in the 3 major oceans. In an attempt to eliminate this costly exercise, it was proposed that the Gemini spacecraft would not deploy parachutes and instead unfurl an inflatable Rogallo wing. Astronauts liked the idea, and rudimentary tests began in 1962 with a tricycle frame beneath a wing made from Irish linen. Soon, an inflatable version of the wing was trialled. Several pilots accustomed to jet fighters became fascinated with the project, and at least 2 X-15 pilots took part in early flights. Control via cables was improved, but there were reliability problems with the deployment of the wing, and NASA opted to follow the recovery at sea technique they had become familiar with, and the Rogallo wing was dropped. For emergencies, the Mercury capsule relied on small but very powerful solid-fueled rockets to pull it clear should the launcher beneath it explode. Primary Gemini designer Jim Chamberlain decided to dispense with the escape tower, opting instead for aircraft-style ejector seats. The seat included a small rocket to push it clear of the spacecraft, and the weight saving over the escape tower was considerable, but the system was not liked by the astronauts. Chamberlain had watched film of exploding Titan missiles and was convinced that the hypergolic fuel they used exploded at a slower rate than the Atlas's oxygen and kerosene combination. Ejection tests were carried out with dummies and from a spacecraft filled with nitrogen, not the pure oxygen that would actually fill the capsule at launch. It was a brave decision to use the ejector seats. In April 1964, the first unmanned Gemini flight was prepared. Gemini 1 would remain in orbit for several days, yet its batteries would only last for 24 hours. When the power ran out, the mission was over. The capsule was loaded with instrumentation to relay data about conditions within the spacecraft while it was being boosted to orbit by its Titan II launcher. The flight was to validate the human rating for the Titan II. As a missile, the Titan II had suffered from severe longitudinal oscillations, and engineers wanted to make certain that their modifications were reliable. While it would not be recovered, to prevent any hostile power from trying to learn anything from it, the heat shield had holes bored through it so the craft would burn up on re-entry. The following year, Gemini 2 was recovered from the mid-Atlantic after a suborbital flight to validate the spacecraft. Though the fuel cells had failed before launch, the capsule had come through the heat of re-entry with flying colors, and the way was open for manned missions to begin. Gus Grissom had been one of the original Mercury 7, NASA's first astronauts. After his flight in the Mercury program, he threw himself into development work for the new Gemini spacecraft. His colleagues even called it the Gusmobile because he had done so much work on the control interface. It was only logical that he would command the first manned Gemini mission. The other crew member was John Young, one of NASA's New 9. On March the 23rd, 1965, Grissom and Young boarded their spacecraft. It would be the last crewed mission to be controlled from the Cape Kennedy Air Force Station. The flight lasted slightly less than 5 hours, making 3 orbits. During that time, Gemini 3 became the first crewed spacecraft to change its orbit. The spacecraft handled re-entry as expected, though it did land 105 kilometers short of the intended target. Part of the Gemini program's brief was to master pinpoint landings. Grissom and Young waited in their craft for half an hour before being recovered. The mission was judged a success, with only a few minor problems with the spacecraft thrusters. It had been almost 2 years since the final flight of the Mercury program, and Americans were happy to see their country back in the space race. Grissom and Young were feted in ticker-tape parades through New York and Chicago, and they were honored by President Johnson in a White House ceremony. At the time, astronauts were given rock star treatment. The next Gemini mission would be more ambitious. NASA had brought forward a spacewalk. Ed White would duplicate the exercise already done by Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov. The Americans were keen to demonstrate they were closing the gap on their Russian rivals. Astronauts could experience limited periods in a microgravity environment when a specially adapted KC-135 aircraft followed a parabolic flight path. Astronauts would have 25 seconds of weightlessness. To rehearse more complex, longer duration routines, the astronaut was suspended in a rig that moved on a low-friction cushion of air. Gemini 4 was the first of NASA's manned flights to be controlled from the new Mission Operations Control Center in Houston. Along with Ed White was command pilot Jim McDivitt. It was the first space flight for both men. The mission was scheduled to last for slightly more than 4 days. For NASA, this would be a new record. It launched in June 1965. Upon reaching orbit, McDivitt tried using the thrusters to rendezvous with the Titan's upper stage. But the stage seemed to move further away, and rapidly depleting fuel forced them to give up. Clearly, rendezvous could not be done intuitively. There were a number of scientific experiments scheduled for the mission, but the crew began to focus upon the major task, the spacewalk. On their third orbit, while passing above Hawaii, Ed White opened his spacecraft door and prepared to step outside. Mission Control were having difficulty with communications, and all messages to and from White had to be relayed via McDivitt.
I don't want to fire the gun yet. Okay, I'm out. Okay, he's out.
White carried a handheld zip gun that helped him maneuver. Apart from making certain that the spacesuit and life support system worked, he had no defined task to perform.
Okay, put a little roll in, bring it right out.
Ground staff were becoming concerned at the poor communication. It was important that White was back inside before he entered the Earth's shadow and before the spacecraft passed out of reach of radio contact with Hawaii.
Okay, I'm coming over.
Okay, stand by.
You see me yet?
I sure don't.
Ah.
Everything seemed easy. White was enjoying himself and was clearly disappointed when he was ordered back inside.
You're right in front, Ed. You look beautiful.
I feel like $1 million. I will pitch up. And y'all laugh.
Difficulties arose when he re-entered the craft. A spring in the locking mechanism on the hatch had failed, and it took 5 minutes of intense effort to safely seal the spacecraft again. During Gemini's 4 days in space, there were reliability issues. Thrusters continued to give problems, and toward the end of the mission, the computer failed. Again, the spacecraft landed short of the intended target zone. The mission was judged a success, but NASA was keen to iron out the hardware difficulties. Mercury veteran Gordon Cooper would lead the next mission with first-time astronaut Pete Conrad. Gemini 5 was to stay in orbit for more than 7 days, and the pair had chosen a Conestoga wagon as a symbol of endurance. Their spacecraft would rely upon fuel cells that combine hydrogen and oxygen to produce electricity, a technology that delivered greater weight savings than batteries, allowing the longer duration flights for trips to the moon. The Agena docking craft was not yet ready, so they would practice rendezvous with a rendezvous evaluation pod they would release from the back of their spacecraft. Because Cooper and Conrad would be in space for so long, a series of observational tasks had been designed for which the crew had made training flights aboard a C-130, photographing geometric patterns on the ground. Hardware problems and storms had caused the original launch attempt to be scrubbed, but 2 days later the Gemini 5 astronauts entered their spacecraft on August 19, 1965. Soon after the end of powered flight, the crew adjusted their orbit and released the rendezvous evaluation pod that Conrad had nicknamed the Little Rascal. Then the problems began. Low oxygen pressure readings in the fuel cells led Cooper, who was out of contact with mission control, to shut down all but essential electrical systems. Now relying on batteries alone, it appeared the mission would have to return early. At the time, no one understood that a malfunctioning heater within the oxygen tank had caused the pressure to drop. By the time they began switching power back on, batteries in the Little Rascal had gone flat, and the rendezvous exercise was no longer possible. On the ground, astronaut Buzz Aldrin began working on a virtual rendezvous where Gemini 5 could navigate to a predetermined point in space. This worked, but soon new problems arose. Thrusters began to misbehave, with numbers 7 and 8 failing completely. With the power shut down, fuel line heaters had cooled, and propellant in the lines had frozen. Gemini 5 drifted through the remainder of its mission, breaking the record for on-orbit duration set 2 years earlier by Russian Valery Bykovsky. Re-entry came 1 orbit early to avoid a tropical storm in the Atlantic. Again, the mission was judged a success. It had set a new duration record, but nothing had gone smoothly. Finally, an Atlas-Agena combination was ready to serve as a target vehicle. Wally Schirra was mission commander, and his pilot was first-timer Tom Stafford. The Agena would launch 2.5 hours before Gemini 6, and the flight plan called for the first rendezvous and docking to happen less than 6 hours into the flight. There were to be 3 more dockings during the flight that would last around 46 hours. When the astronauts were being strapped into their spacecraft, the Atlas-Agena was entering the final stage of its countdown.
5, 4, it's holding momentarily at 4. We have ignition. Start, we have a liftoff.
The launch was perfect. However, communications from the Agena went dead.
We had a very dramatic loss of telemetry from the Agena, and we should have gotten the Agena burned to place us in orbit.
The Gemini launch was cancelled, and Stafford and Girard were left without a mission. A decision was made to postpone Gemini 6, now called Gemini 6A, until just after the launch of Gemini 7, and the two spacecraft would rendezvous. First-time astronauts Frank Borman and Jim Lovell had been training for the Gemini 7 mission in a specially developed lightweight version of the G4C spacesuit to allow more comfort during the flight. Gemini 7 had always been intended as a long-duration flight. Mission planners had been hoping for 14 days. The objective was to solve design problems with spacecraft systems and to see what effects prolonged weightlessness would have on the crew. The long-duration mission now had another benefit. It would allow enough time for Gemini 6's Titan booster to be erected and launched so that the important space rendezvous could finally happen. On December the 12th, for the second time, the Gemini 6 crew prepared for launch.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
After less than 2 seconds, the engines shut down.
No liftoff. The engines have shut down.
An umbilical plug had separated prematurely. For a second time, Girard and Stafford failed to launch. 3 days later, Gemini 6 made its third launch attempt. It was successful. Little more than 5 hours later, after several very accurate course corrections, the two Gemini capsules were flying side by side. NASA was delighted, and the footage of the spacecraft in orbit was shown around the world. Gemini 6 returned to an accurate splashdown after a flight that lasted 1 day, leaving Borman and Lovell in Gemini 7 to continue their record-breaking flight for a further 2 days. Some of the thrusters were failing, as were the fuel cells, and the spacecraft had to rely on battery power for the remainder of the mission. After 14 days, they returned to the Atlantic around 12 kilometers from their target point. Borman and Lovell were weakened by their time in space, but rapidly returned to full health. After the Gemini program's 5th manned flight, NASA had achieved 1 spacewalk and 1 rendezvous, and there were still reliability issues with the spacecraft. Because there had been so many equipment failures, all remaining Gemini flights were now slated to be docking missions, and astronauts were spending long hours practicing docking maneuvers in the simulator. More mishaps could damage the schedule mission planners were still hoping to fulfill, so contingency arrangements were made. Deke Slayton, who had been chosen as one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, was now in a senior role at the astronaut office charged with crew selection. Astronauts had to train as backup crew for a mission 3 flights before flying their own allocated mission, and setup of spacecraft before launch became the responsibility of the backup crew. It became customary to take a version of the crew photograph that included the backup astronauts. Gemini 8's prime crew of Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott was backed up by Pete Conrad and Dick Gordon. Gemini 9's prime crew of Elliot See and Charles Bassett was backed up by Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan. Because NASA's research centers and the manufacturers that fabricated the agency's space hardware were scattered across the United States, it was customary for astronauts to shuttle between training responsibilities in one of NASA's T-38 jet trainers. All astronauts were qualified jet pilots, and they had to keep their flying hours up, so NASA maintained a fleet of T-38s for this purpose. Early in 1966, 2 T-38s left the Manned Spacecraft Center for the McDonnell plant in Missouri. C and Bassett, Gemini 9's prime crew, died instantly when their plane hit the McDonnell building. Bad weather had set in, and an inquiry found pilot error was responsible. The backup crew of Stafford and Cernan in the other aircraft landed safely. NASA had suffered its first casualties, and Stafford and Cernan became the Gemini 9 prime crew. There would be no delay in the Gemini flight schedule. After the failure of the Gemini 6 Agena, its builders, Lockheed, were keenly aware of the growing lack of confidence in their target vehicle. They instigated a plan for changes to the Agena's engine. A corrective program, known as Project Surefire, had determined that an explosive hard start had destroyed the Gemini 6 Agena. To prevent this, oxidizer would be fed to the engine slightly before the fuel started to flow. As a contingency, McDonnell had suggested a docking collar could be mounted on an electronics package without Lockheed's Agena. It could be built using existing technology. Because it was light, it could be launched by the Atlas without the need for an upper stage. Known as the Augmented Target Docking Adapter, or ATDA, it was built and held in storage. The Gemini 8 astronauts had been rehearsing NASA's second spacewalk. Dave Scott would wear an emergency life support chest pack, as well as being connected to an umbilical tether that also supplied his spacesuit with oxygen and electrical power. In addition, a backpack stored in the rear of the Gemini adapter contained a radio and 8 kilograms of propellant for a maneuvering zip gun. The flight plan called for 2 spacewalks. The first would last for more than 2 hours. The second involved the backpack propulsion unit and a much longer tether. It was cumbersome, and Scott flew more than 300 zero-G parabolas, learning how to cope with the equipment. In March 1966, the Gemini 8 mission was in the final stages of preparation. For Mission Commander Neil Armstrong, this was his first spaceflight. His pilot, Dave Scott, was also a first-timer. Their mission was intended to last for 3 days, during which they would dock with the Agena 4 times. The plan had the Gemini spacecraft launching 100 minutes after the Agena and catching up with it on the 4th orbit. 2 launch centers at the Cape worked independently during the countdowns of the Atlas Agena and Gemini 8's Titan II. Control of the mission would transfer to Houston only after each rocket had cleared the launch tower. NASA was bussing in crowds of important people to watch the twin launches, and bleachers had been erected at a safe distance. NASA Administrator James Webb was acutely aware of the need to court public opinion, so spectacular launch events were now drawing big numbers. As Armstrong and Scott were being strapped into their capsule, the Atlas Agena was entering the final stages of its countdown. Everyone understood that should the target vehicle fail again, the flight would be postponed while mission planners figured out what to do.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
Engine start, we have a liftoff.
This time, the Atlas Agena combination launched perfectly. The Agena went into a near-circular 300-kilometer orbit. In the spacecraft, Scott and Armstrong knew the mission's first task had been accomplished. Orbital parameters of the Agena required a precise launch.
2, 1, 0.
Gemini 8 blasted off on schedule. Mission Control were happy with the Gemini's lower, faster orbit, and the chase began. In less than 6 hours, Gemini 8 was station-keeping with the Agena. Passing above southern Africa, the spacecraft docked. Mission controllers were jubilant, yet trouble uploading commands to the Agena made planners suspicious of its attitude control. Before Gemini 8 passed out of radio contact, capsule communicator Jim Lovell warned them to undock if they experienced any difficulties. Soon, the docked spacecraft started a combined yaw and roll. Armstrong separated from the Agena, but the rate of spin increased. Thruster number 8 was stuck on. Spinning rapidly, the crew's vision became blurred, and Mission Control feared Armstrong and Scott might pass out. Neil Armstrong knew that the only way to regain control was to use the big thrusters in the re-entry system. This worked, but mission rules stated that a return to the ground must happen rapidly. Gemini 8 re-entered the atmosphere, heading for a landing in the Pacific, an ocean away from its planned landing point in the Atlantic. A secondary recovery team was waiting off the coast of Okinawa, and the crew were picked up 3 hours after their craft hit the water. Armstrong was depressed that his mission had been severely curtailed, and worried that Scott had not made his spacewalk. But Gemini 8 made the first docking, and important people took note of the way Armstrong had remained calm in a dangerous situation. Before the launch of Gemini 9, members of the press were introduced to a new device that would be tested during the next mission. The Astronaut Maneuvering Unit, or AMU, had been designed by the Air Force, who hoped to use it in conjunction with a planned manned orbiting laboratory. Practice with the unit on the ground was done on a near-frictionless surface, but it was a poor simulation of the conditions that could be expected in weightlessness. Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan on Gemini 9 had the objectives of rendezvous, docking, and a spacewalk, including the use of the AMU. The target vehicle was launched on May the 17th, 1966. It functioned well until it was out of sight, when a short circuit sent the Atlas booster into a nosedive. Mission Control recalled the crew and NASA began work on its Plan B. Because of the Agena's questionable reliability, the augmented target docking adapter was ready, and Atlas builders Convair supplied another booster in record time. This combination launched less than 2 weeks later. After a second false start, caused by software difficulties, astronauts Stafford and Cernan launched successfully the following day. When they caught up with the target vehicle, it was obvious that docking would again not be possible. Tom Stafford described it as an angry alligator. The shroud protecting the craft during passage through the atmosphere was still attached. Among the things NASA was learning from Project Gemini was not to make stupid mistakes. The target adapter was different to the Agena, and a squabble between contractors had seen the experienced engineer responsible for installing the shroud sidelined. Suggestions about nudging the shroud with the spacecraft were rejected as too dangerous. The next objective was the spacewalk and the use of the AMU, but Cernan discovered everything took longer than anticipated and he was rapidly tiring. When the inside of his helmet started fogging, the exercise was abandoned. NASA had never liked the AMU, and it was scrapped. These Gemini spacewalk problems led to big changes in the way NASA approached the task. They understood that it would be unthinkable for a team that landed on the moon to remain inside the spacecraft. The next generation Apollo spacesuits incorporated an inner layer networked with fine tubing that carried water as a more positive means of preventing the wearer from overheating. However, at this stage, the new suit required a lot more work. For the remainder of the Gemini series, astronauts would continue with the air-cooled G4C suit. Michael Collins, who was to make 2 spacewalks on Gemini 10, had been training in a vacuum chamber that gave him a feel for working inside his spacesuit when it was swollen, as it would be in space. The ponderous training on a cushion of air remained the best that they could think of for extended spacewalk simulation. After the familiar dual launch of the Agena and the Titan II, John Young and Michael Collins caught up with the target vehicle on the 4th orbit, but a misalignment of the Gemini 10 craft during one maneuver required orbital corrections that burned large amounts of fuel. Young and Collins docked with the Agena, and after clearance from Mission Control, used the target vehicle's main engine to lift the combined craft to a higher orbit. While passing above Africa, Collins opened his hatch for a stand-up spacewalk. From the higher orbit, he photographed stars in the southern Milky Way. The exercise went smoothly until a suspected contaminant in the life support system caused both astronauts to complain of stinging eyes. The spacewalk was terminated, and the problem was determined to be from having both suit fans switched on at the same time. The craft dropped down to a lower orbit that allowed them to catch up with the dormant Agena used for the Gemini 8 mission. Collins did make a second spacewalk, but it was difficult, and it was curtailed because of low thruster fuel levels. 2 months later, Dick Gordon on Gemini 11 had similar difficulties during his first spacewalk. Every task took much longer than anticipated, with fatigue and maintaining his body position being major problems. One objective of the Gemini program had been mastered. The return to Earth was now routinely under computer control, and spacecraft were splashing down in view of their recovery ship. There was only one scheduled Gemini mission left, and yet the program had still not discovered how an astronaut could work effectively outside the capsule in the vacuum of space. changes were made. A new underwater training routine was introduced. NASA had set up a Gemini Agena mock-up in the swimming pool at the McDonough School near Baltimore, and astronaut Buzz Aldrin would be the first to rehearse his mission routine there. In addition, astronauts venturing outside the spacecraft had requested handles and handrails. Gemini 9 had 9 restraining points. This had increased to 44 for Gemini 12. For work at the back of the spacecraft, where specialist items were stored and a workstation had been set up, tailored foot restraints were installed, so an astronaut could anchor himself firmly to eliminate the struggle to maintain body position when using a wrench. As Aldrin and Mission Commander Jim Lovell crossed to the base of the launch gantry, they displayed the words, "The End," on their backs. The final Gemini flight was to be the most complex. This would also be the last manned launch controlled from the Complex 19 blockhouse. It had to be close to the launch tower because the pre-digital instrumentation demanded it. Jim Lovell presented the pad closeout chief Gunter Wendt with a redundancy check for $1 million Deutschmarks.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Upon reaching orbit, Lovell and Aldrin began tracking the target vehicle with radar, but reception soon became patchy, forcing the astronauts to rely upon sextant sightings and paper tables to make the rendezvous maneuvers. Aldrin, who had a doctorate in orbital mechanics, used a slide rule for the calculations. This was a good test, enabling the pair to demonstrate the viability of rendezvous via more basic methods. Docking was achieved simply, and the pair practiced the maneuver using different approaches. It was decided to abandon using the Agena to fly to a higher altitude, as telemetry had revealed a loss of engine chamber pressure during its boost to orbit. On the ground, mission planners reinstated an earlier objective, the photographing of a partial solar eclipse. If the Gemini crew could get to the right part of their orbit at the right time, they would have just 8 seconds to photograph the partially obscured sun. It worked, and again the last-minute change of plan was a good test of the complete team to react quickly as events changed. This meant the crew had little time to prepare for the essential element of the mission, but the hatch opened at the scheduled time, 20 minutes before the capsule passed into the Earth's shadow. The first EVA was a simple stand-up, with Aldrin's legs remaining inside the spacecraft. He was methodical about every move. After almost 2 complete orbits, he was back inside with the hatch sealed. While the mission was going well, engineers on the ground were keeping an eye on several worrying signs from the spacecraft's subsystems, particularly the fuel cells. The next day, Aldrin left the spacecraft entirely and made his way to the Agena. He had a completely different approach to his work outside. His experience as a scuba diver and his underwater training, combined with the additional anchor points on the Gemini and Agena craft, transformed the nature of the spacewalk. While working on the Agena, Aldrin attached a tether between the 2 craft, returning to the Gemini capsule after a highly successful 2 hours and 6 minutes. Everything had run smoothly, and mission controllers were delighted. NASA was aware of the high fuel usage involved in station keeping, and they wanted to see if a tether was a practical method to keep 2 spacecraft in proximity. They also wanted to set the 2 craft spinning around each other, to generate a small amount of artificial gravity. After almost 4 days in space, Gemini 12 re-entered the atmosphere. The return to Earth was controlled by the onboard computer, and the craft splashed down in the Atlantic close to its recovery ship, the aircraft carrier Wasp. The celebration at the completion of a difficult yet highly successful series of space flights continued, and NASA felt confident that maneuvers required for a trip to the moon were no longer theoretical. President Kennedy's moon landing deadline was met, but the contributions that the Gemini program made to modern spaceflight are overlooked. Every journey to the International Space Station uses the rendezvous and docking procedures pioneered during Gemini. And later this decade, the Mars Sample Return mission that will bring back specimen tubes already being collected on the Red Planet will see the first rendezvous in Mars orbit, which again builds on the legacy of Gemini. Astronauts and cosmonauts carry out routine maintenance on the ISS using expertise developed during Gemini. And all spacewalks are elaborately rehearsed in vast neutral buoyancy pools in Houston or Moscow, again pioneered during the Gemini program.